Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, it's my pleasure to welcome Xin Wang, a curator and art historian based in New York City, and a PhD candidate in art history at New York University's Institute of Fine Art and Fine Arts. Her most recent curatorial project, 2-Year Eternity, is the fourth Art and Technology biennial at the Today Art Museum in Beijing, and it's still up. So you have time to rush back and catch it before it closes on October 15th. It's been extended. Great. So you have a little bit more time. Who's going? Previous curatorial projects have included China, Africa, at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York in 2018, the Bank Show, which included work by Hito Steirl and Saigo Chang and Erno Meek, and Badlands Unlimited, which is Paul Chan's press, and Rocks Media Collective, an Indian group, which was mounted at the Bank Union Building in Shanghai's Bund district in 2014. A solo show, Luoyang Arcade, which was the Shanghai-based artist's first solo exhibition in New York City. And that was at Wall Play, which is a storefront on Canal Street, in conjunction with Asia Contemporary Art Week 2014, for which Xin served as associate curator. Xin also contributed research and perhaps organization to ink art past and present in contemporary China at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2013. She served on selection juries for Creative Capital, The Shed, Anonymous Was a Woman, which is an interesting grant opportunity for female artists, and Keith Haring Fellowship for Art and Activism at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. Xin Wang's writing has been published in Art Agenda, Art in America, E-Flux Journal, I shared those essays with you, Art Forum, and Leap, which is a publication based in Beijing, I believe. And she's contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs. Her essay, Machine Envy, is going to be published as a book chapter in a forthcoming volume published by MIT Press in 2024, so next year, called Machine Decision is Not Final, China and the History and Future of Artificial Intelligence. That sounds really timely. She has served as a visiting critic in the photography department, the graduate MFA photography department at Yale for a few years, as a teaching fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and also as an adjunct professor at Ramapo College in New Jersey. And she received a Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant in 2021. In addition to being very close to a PhD at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, she received an MA, a Master's in Art History from Columbia University, and an undergraduate degree in art history and mathematics, and also psychology, a triple degree. From Hamilton College in upstate New York. Please join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Xin Wang.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. That was an embarrassingly thorough introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I love talking with artists and working with artists because I think we art historians and artists face very similar challenges. And as you can see, my title today is called It's Giving Art History. And it's not just a vibe, but I also think there's a lot of pragmatic application to how we think about art, create art, and contextualize them. And as you probably know, there's a lot of misunderstanding or misconception around art history as a discipline. And even within our discipline is that it's maybe very retrogressive, it's too formally focused, but at the same time, I think there's unique rigor to thinking about the intrinsic qualities of visual arts, how we work through that we don't necessarily find in all of these other theoretical or cross-disciplinary frameworks that are nevertheless very helpful. But I'm sure many of you can relate that sometimes there's a seduction to seeking other theories to legitimize our practice. But at the same time, you know, if we look very closely to how art history, not just as, you know, a academic discipline, but a continuum, and sometimes anachronistic, meaning not always occurring on a linear time frame, how participants think about previous artists, previous periods of time, and projecting into the future, it can be quite revealing. So I'm invoking the art historian Molly Nesbitt's notion in her most recent publication, The Pragmatism in the History of Art, where she sees a work of art not as a composition, but as quote unquote, an event infiltrated by other events. And this is the framework through which I'm hoping to introduce two of my current projects with you. One of them is this art and tech biennial that I just opened a few months ago in Beijing, and the other one would be my PhD dissertation titled Soviet Hauntology, and really thinking about how historical precedents haunt present thinking, and in both very conscious and, more importantly, unconscious ways. I want to start with a slide that I used. This is actually one of my favorite slides when I was giving pandemic era Zoom lectures for the Whitney Museum. While I was working in the capacity of a joint teaching fellow, and I was giving topics based on the museum's collection around themes such as Asian/American perspectives, art and technology, and sometimes more focused on specific artists. And I'm sure many of us during the pandemic were, you know, playing video games like Animal Crossing, and I was doing that too. So the image you see on the right was Isamu Noguchi conceptual design from 1947, which, as many of you know, is a crucial date. It was 2 years after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the Second World War, and it's even more fraught when we think about Noguchi as a Japanese-American artist reflecting on that event, both its, you know, ideological magnitude, but also from the perspective of the entire mankind, the nuclear escalation and nuclear destruction that I think we're still finding ourselves in its shadows, right? And as I was talking about this work and thinking about it, I realized that the face that Noguchi chose for this monument of a post-atomic humanity, he's essentially imagining making a monument after the entire human race has been wiped out by nuclear destruction. He wanted to make a face that marks the surface of the earth that could be seen from Mars. And I noticed that the face is almost a direct reference to this pre-modern Japanese burial art form, which is called haniwa. They're used to mark tombs, they're terracotta sculptures, and they sometimes take the shape of a warrior, other times animals, and sometimes very simple and abstract. I have an example on the upper left corner. This is an actual one from the Metropolitan Museum. And I realized that in the game design, there are a lot of direct borrowing of that. And so this fascinating cross-temporal and medium continuation of this form fascinated me. And of course, Noguchi is an artist who's very art historically aware, but more often we learn of his references to Greek and Roman forms of art history like Kouros, less from pre-modern Asian art. So this was a favorite slide precisely for those reasons. And so when I was invited to curate the fourth Future of Today biennial, which is an art and technology themed biennial at Beijing's Today Art Museum, with this wonderful poster designed by He Pianpian and Max Harvey, I immediately thought of creating this monument, not to Noguchi's original scale, because there's no way we can make something so big that can be seen from Mars. But nonetheless, there might be a possibility to reproduce the kind of monumentality that gives the audience a sense of that sort of presence, or that kind of future where it might be imminent. And also, more importantly, the main hall of this museum is 12 meters high, which is about 40 feet. So it's gigantic. We need something to fill it. So on the right, this is the installation process where we're trying to build it out on a scaffolding. And miraculously, this went up in 3 days, to my utter surprise. And I want to just show this animated part a little bit more, because I really love the graphic design, because the designers clearly understood the assignment. And To Our Eternity, as some of you know, is also the name of an anime series that I found incredibly philosophical in its own reflection about how we understand life and how we acquire knowledge through inhabiting different life forms. And it's also important for me when I curate an art and technology exhibition, to instill a dimension of art history into it, because contrary to popular belief and the fact that art and tech shows are becoming popular in the past few years, artists haven't only just started to think about it. And nowhere for me is a more important beginning than this moment when artists really start to respond to nuclear power, nuclear technology. Directly across from the hall, I have a large animation that is projected on a 4 meters high LED screen titled Vacation by a very young artist based in New York. And it's hard to, narrate what a video work is about, but it also has a similarly post-apocalyptic, but also funny narrative to it, where it's like Alice in Wonderland, except the main character is a US college student whose car got stranded on a beach. And then he found himself in a series of unlikely encounters with animals who are going through divorce and getting into a kind of a large post-industrial complex where different departments control the production of snowflakes or planetary materials. And directly in front of the Noguchi monument are a series of sculptures by another very young Chinese artist, Liu Xin, who's currently based in London, who almost obsessively works with space as a medium. She was trained in precision machines in one of China's most technically advanced universities. And for this series of work called White Stone, she chased and looked into the history of the rockets that were launched in northwestern China and collected debris from those rockets, from those launches, and combined them with cement to create these large-scale objects. And what was really interesting was that a lot of these debris, actually most of them, are national-owned property and shouldn't be privately repurposed. There was a foundation that has some of these and donated to the artists. So they're also a very compelling presence, and they're presented on this kind of varying platform, forming a dialogue with Noguchi's monument to be seen from Mars. This gives you two other perspectives to look at it. And you can really see that the installation team did a fantastic job doing the modeling of this face to be seen from Mars. And the varying levels of the platform also allows visitors to walk onto them and then walk among the artworks, so that you feel like you're navigating the space rather than standing next to it. And to either side of this platform, I again think about earlier examples from art history where artists are having these cosmic imaginations, sometimes in very abstract, theoretical, even mathematical terms. And this is Yamajani, an Iranian artist who immigrated to the States in the 70s, I think. And he was creating some of these proto-land art like pieces that are, purely based on calculation. This one called Tsukhovsky's Tower is named after one of the founding fathers of modern astrophysics, astronomy. And essentially, this is a model of a space elevator that can be self-balanced in space, because one end is being pulled by Earth's gravitational power and the other by the pull from the other side. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see the number, but this is an incredibly tall and impossible structure, and yet this has formed the basis for a lot of sci-fi imaginations, a kind of space elevator that can connect life on Earth to space exploration. And to think that this happened in 1969 and still feels really fresh. It feels quite appropriate for the scope of the exhibition. And on the other side, I borrowed this photograph from Ami Lei. I'm sorry, I think the name cut out on the slide. But Ami Lei, as some of you might know, is one of the most important Asian American artists, photographers working at the moment. And she's about to have a large retrospective at the MoMA in November, so be sure to go see that. This is a beguilingly peaceful work. We're looking at a US Navy ship, a medical ship, kind of parked on a very peaceful, tranquil ocean. But if you look at where this location was, even when we know that this is a peaceful and medical mission, the implications of history is quite heavy. And this is, I would argue, a true hallmark to Ami Lei's work, who herself was a Vietnam War refugee who immigrated to the US. And what I find incredible about her work is that instead of telling her own story or making her own experience or explain or interpret her own stories and experiences, she turns the gaze towards American life and its international, the implications of the international military intervention in which she herself was implicated. And so here on the right, I'm showing an example where you can see Liu Xin's sculpture in relation to Ami Lei. But on the left, I wanted to show a feature of this exhibition where I included kind of questions and frameworks and sometimes direct quotations from the artist, so that when visitors navigate through the exhibition, there are certain ideas to think through, but it's not a direct explanation about what that artwork is. And here you could see I quoted from Ami, where she says, "I'm constantly casting and recasting the landscape. It is a force of nature, mercurial, volatile. It is my muse." And the work that I borrowed came from a series. Well, this is just another of Ami's incredible works where she looks at the theatrics of politics that are reinterpreted by another entertainment format, Saturday Night Live. I think for local students, this is probably very familiar, but for international students, this is just a national entertainment program where comedians satirize various phenomena, including political figures. So there had been a lot of episodes during the Trump presidency. So we're actually looking at the Oval Office, but on set. It's not the actual one, but in terms of its potency, it's probably on par with the actual one. And originally, I had intended to borrow this one, or actually Almei suggested to me that we can use this one, which came from the same series, titled Events Ashore. And we're getting into really exciting stuff, because this is where Ami was invited to embed with US Navy ships as they prepared to deploy to Iraq. And but she was embedded with a more non-combat peaceful missions. So these included humanitarian missions to Africa and Asia, as well as scientific expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic. And so this is one of those images, but you can clearly see US soldiers in their suits, uniforms, and the top form of a nuclear submarine emerging beneath the ice cape. I thought this was vague enough, but my colleagues told me, my colleagues in Beijing, they did a reverse image search and found out that this image has already been used to illustrate an article that reports on the US military expansion in the Arctic. So they told me this might be sensitive and people might complain. And so this is just one of many cases I had to deal with in navigating censorship and people's sensibilities. So that's why we took it out, and yet I find it relevant to include this because I find censorship can represent a very powerful form of intimacy because it means the other person or the censors, especially when they can't explain why they find certain works uncomfortable, it indicates a very intense emotional engagement with the work. And also, quite honestly, some of these censors are the hardest working art audience members because they have to go through, they would actually watch the entire art videos, you know, to tell you which parts are problematic and which parts to block out. The extent to which they invest their energy sometimes, you know, is ironically touching because they are doing a deep read, you can argue. And of course, this is not a case unique to China because when I was complaining to some of the artists in my show that, oh, I have to deal with this, they told me that they have encountered it in various contexts. For instance, this one was considered a little problematic and sensitive when Ami was invited to present a solo show in Vietnam. And we had a few theories about why this might be touchy. It could be just the stiff-seated postures or the military uniform or just such a clear dichotomy of, you know, US and Vietnamese personnel that might hit home too close. But we never know. The show was canceled despite the artist's best effort to support it. Another work that I think is tellingly and fascinatingly sensitive is Li Jiabao's Squid Map. And this is an artist who also works in serious scientific research. And this is a remarkably simple but powerful work. These are two video stills, and in the middle of both of these stills, you can see a tiny clump. This is a Hawaiian squid that has a habit of flaring sand onto its back so that it could cover itself, so it's camouflage. So the artist decided to create a map of the US and the map of Greater China and give the squid a month. So after a month, as you can see on the right, the squid has completely smudged the human sanctioned borderlines and created its own kind of black and white composition. And the artist was relating hard to this because she was also crossing national borders and navigating identities all the time. And wouldn't it be nice to just flare it and, you know, mess it all up like the squid did? Other works that I thought would be sensitive, but somehow was able to allowed to be exhibited was Annie Liu's Surrogacy. This is another artist who works very seriously with scientific research, particularly in relation to motherhood as a technology and as labor and a frontier of experiment. So here you can see that this is a close-up where she created a 3D transparent model of a pig uterus. I think a lot of us know that pigs can produce a lot of piglets in one pregnancy, whereas it's more laborious for humans. So she's imagining having the pig uterus carry the burden for human mothers. So in some of these components, you can see there are tiny pigs, but other parts show tiny babies. The work is also titled Surrogacy, which is not legal in China. And so this is, an installation view that is pretty dramatic because it's lit from underneath. And it's very tiny, actually. You have to come up to it in order to, you have to come very close to it to understand what is happening. So maybe the scale helped in this case. And we placed it right next to an early Tishanshu drawing. So Tishanshu is another artist who is recently enjoying a lot of attention and appreciation, but back in the 80s, he was already making works because of his prolonged exposure to computer screens, working at a law firm, in addition to creating art. He was already thinking about ways that the human skin and the computer screen can form a continuum. And so on the other side, we commissioned a special wallpaper from Tishan that communicates that idea. It's kind of unsettling when you look at it, but at the same time, it feels very relevant to our day-to-day reality. And I actually brought intentionally a lot of Asian American artists to this exhibition because I'm quite curious to see how that context might shift when we look at the topics in China. And the most pointed work is probably Astria Subrak's Asian Futurism Without Asians. This is a series of research-based performance lectures this Thai American artist created, where she looked very carefully at various forms of Asian-esque representations in Hollywood sci-fi movies, from the type of food to decor, interior design, costume, femininity, masculinity that are usually stereotypically represented, to really interrogate how the Hollywood sci-fi entertainment industry really flatten all of these Asian sources of cultural inspiration, which could have been mined further for much more interesting storytelling. And people actually were quite receptive to this work and find it incredibly informative. It's both strange and familiar. Another commissioned work from Mauritian Aliari, a young Iranian artist who likes to work with digital media, but thinking about how it relates to prehistoric forms, but also tweaking that to think about queerness and political agency in the present moment. And this is another special design created by the artist for the exhibition space, because they're reflective. So when we mounted it to the wall, it corresponds in color and in its reflection to the large scale videos around. So these are not, digital manipulation. They just have these colors and reflections when the video works in the main hall are transitioning and forming different, transitioning into different slides. And another image for scale, and you can peek through a little bit of Tishanshu in the back. And another view, just to give you a sense of how beautifully it constantly changes. Another goal I wanted to challenge, I guess, existing norms in art and technology shows is to include more, well, maybe not traditional media, but mediums usually not considered for such exhibitions, including lacquerware. This is a lacquer piece created by a very young artist who specialized in the medium called Cavity. But if you look at the image and the composition, it doesn't really strike you as a traditional lacquer piece, but it's actually inspired by one of her favorite rock bands, and the imagery recalls more, like electronic circuitry or sort of navigation in cosmic space. But what was really inspiring for me was to hear her talk about the technological and the biotechnological aspect of working with lacquer, because it's a medium or material that is very much alive, and it causes allergic reactions in people who work with it, in some cases fatally so. So you have to invest your physical health in working with the notably difficult medium that requires a lot of patience, understanding of its material science. And on the fourth level of the exhibition at the exhibition designer so brilliantly created to then look back onto the main exhibition hall. So you're at a very elevated space that gives you different perspectives into these monumental constructions. But the show is not without more presence, kind of new media works. There are 2 video games in this show, for instance, and one of them is kind of a retro video game created by this team that are looking back at the early 90s in China, in a northern industrial town, and when people are just transitioning from nation-owned industries to self-driven entrepreneurship. And it's quite meta because sometimes you see within the video games an arcade like this one. And this is the installation where you can see people playing on these older models. We're intentionally using these older models for people to play with. And this is actually one of the only works that got officially censored, but not in the sense that it was taken out, but rather we need to put out signs where teenagers are not allowed to play because video games are banned or they're highly restricted for teenagers. Which is really odd because I don't think younger kids would quite understand the retro aesthetic of these games. And in the back, I included 200 individual photographs of electronic factory workers by this artist called Zhan Youbing. He is himself a migrant worker, and he devoted his entire career collecting vernacular materials. For instance, posters found in dorms of factory workers, and for instance, these name cards and photographs of workers that in the factories that he worked in or he had access to, which is an incredible archive of labor relating to China's enormous technological industry that I think also a lot of art and tech shows don't think about, or at least don't think about through involving an artist who is directly involved or implicated, whose labor is also implicated. As you can see, all of their names are written in addition to their serial workers number. And I really like how this intersects this video game piece that is also about entrepreneurship. And more boldly, I also juxtapose his images of migrant workers with a young photographer Punka's portrait of the figurehead of Huawei, which is the most important technological companies in China. And I also realized that over the past few years, going back home, it has effectively created its own digital realm where everything, all of the digital infrastructures on your phone is dependent on Huawei's system. So now I have to have 2 phones in order to operate. I used to just have 1. So this wasn't even an artwork, this portrait on the left. It was a commissioned image for the Washington Post. But I found it incredible in the way the artists clearly tapped into earlier modes of portraiture, and represents this figure not just as a person, but also as someone who wields huge ideological power and symbolic power, if you think about patriotism and technology. And I was told that there are people from Huawei who visited and who were a little bit unhappy about this, because I don't think it's a clear endorsement nor a direct criticism, but in general, I think Washington Post is considered more critical of China, so they are feeling slightly uncomfortable. Now, switching gear, I want to check what time it is. Do I have the time? Oh, great. I think we're good on time. So switching gear a little bit to my dissertation topic, which is not entirely unrelated, to portraits like this, and going back again to what I talked about earlier about a work of art, not as a fixed static piece, but as an event infiltrated by other events. Some of you may have read my essay on Eflux Journal, where I provided an overview of the Soviet Hauntology research. Essentially, I was trying to understand this question how come a painting that was created by a late 19th century Russian painter who became co-opted in Stalin's formulation of socialist realism is still present in my elementary school textbook. And because of the circulation of this version of the textbook that distributed over 100 million copies, is arguably the best known art historical image in modern China. And this is the condition that fascinates me. I'm not interested in doing a fixed study about Ilya Repin or Pierre Vishnicki, the group that he belonged to, who, just like their contemporaries in France, like Gustave Courbet, was shifting their attention to academic or religious or metaphorical paintings to actual people and their sufferings, or the prototype of proletariat. And nor was I interested in just focusing on the transference of knowledge, throughout the 20th century, through this Sino-Soviet relationship, but really how this has evolved over time and how this is still so relevant and so familiar. I also made the argument in the essay that, we didn't really understand this as an art historical object because it's an illustration in our textbooks where we learn about language, literature, morality. And it is at the same time, it is the perfect medium for images like this to insert itself in the most subliminal way. I realized this when I went to St. Petersburg a few years ago before the pandemic, and very fortunately caught a Repin retrospective. And when I saw this painting for the first time, it triggered a very profound emotion that I didn't experience before as an art historian. We learn many things in textbooks, and then you see them in Italy, right, in museums, in churches. This one just felt ontologically a lot more significant. And this is an image of Chinese artists who were sent to the Soviet Union in the 50s, where they're also, directly learning from the Bartholder-Samvogar River. I'm sure many of you here recognize it. I was told by a lot of my Eastern European friends, people from post-socialist states, they immediately recognize this work. So this presence, this condition of its continued relevancy is very, very exciting to me. And going back to my earlier point, it's not only not an art historical image, it was also not so ideologically charged like a Mao portrait or the kind of stereotypical socialist realism images that you associate with. That has a very strong and almost overbearing message. It is like a Warholian object, like the Campbell soup cans. It's part of the vernacular, but it has its own ideological persuasion, its own historical mediation. And these are images created by Maximov Konstantin, who was the official Soviet pedagogue sent to China, who taught at the Central Academy of Fine Art from 1954 to 1957. And during those years, he completely imported the Soviet pedagogy to China's most prestigious art academy. And the 21 people who attended that training went through what had been 5 years in the Soviet Union, but he condensed the coursework in 2 years. And these people ended up being deans of art academies, presidents, and some of the highest earning and most recognizable artists. But I would also argue it really solidified a broader public relationship to realism, our adherence to it, our obsession with it, and a certain appetite for a certain kind of realism. And on the left is Maximov Konstantin's one of his pretty signature works called Sasha the Tractor Driver. And on the right was a painting created of a very famous Chinese artist, Xi Baishi, while he was in Beijing. And this is also an artist who was very indebted to Repin, and he himself in his biography talked about how important it is to find or craft a sort of realism that is able to speak to the spirit of the subject. And again, I think this goes against the grain of the more rigid or flattened or kind of socialist realism on steroid that we're more familiar with, or are brought up in art historical contexts. And what is significant to me is that while I was researching these artists, I was deeply indebted to artists whose art historical impulse brought these earlier figures to my attention. And some of you might recognize this is a work by Cai Guoqiang, the Sky Ladder. Cai Guoqiang is an artist who's internationally renowned, worked on these gunpowder and firework spectacles. But in 2002, for his solo exhibition in Shanghai, he had a section dedicated to Maximov Constantine. And yes, and this is he created the section for his own solo show. So there's his own works, but then within it, a tribute to another artist. And if you read his rationale for this, it's just the purest kind of art historical impulse, where he talked about how could a figure who is so foundational to modern Chinese art history, so little known, and this is also someone who has educated my teachers' teachers, and who is, you can say by accident, accountable for so much that has happened and paved way for so much for what was to come, and yet was very little understood. So he went on to collect about 100 of his paintings, and he's also amassed an archive with multilingual materials on Maximov in his studio right here in New York. So it's also very convenient if you want to visit, and you can just request a visit with the studio, which is located on the Lower East Side. And here are some images where you can see Maximov taking students, either directing them in the studio or in open air, doing sketches and being surrounded by locals who are curious about what the heck was going on. And this kind of pedagogical exchanges lasted throughout the 50s, even after the Sino-Soviet relationship went sour in 1960, because another pedagogue from Romania was immediately recruited, who brought a very different kind, although adjacent trajectory of socialist realism and painting practice to another art academy. And I'm really just fascinated by looking at what is even in the background of what they're currently working on. What Konstantin Maximov brought to Beijing was a system of training in realism rooted in an earlier pedagogue called Pavel Chestyakov, who is an Imperial Russian artist. And there's an example on the left, but if you're, if you're an art student who are aspiring to attend an art academy in China, for instance, this is a level of technical skill you're still required to obtain. And on the right is a very, very famous study by a Chinese artist that I will talk about in the upcoming slides. You'll meet her very soon, but she was quite famous for making this while she was a student, because she was just so technically superb. And one of the students who attended Maximov's training, Ho Yiming, created this painting for his graduation in 1957, and it's called Underground Workers. He is painting a group of progressive young students before 1949, so the communist liberation of China. And they're underground communist teenagers who are printing and distributing flyers. And what is remarkable is that Ho Yiming himself this was the kind of activities he himself was engaged in around 48. And as some of you know, if you're engaged in underground political activities, the likelihood of getting killed before liberation or even after is quite high. He somehow was able to live and tell the story. One of Hou Yinmin's students, Chen Danqing, another artist I'll talk about in fuller scale later, remarked that this was a marvelous Soviet oil painting, both in the subject matter, but also in the kind of revolutionary narrative and the political aesthetic charge to it that can only happen to this kind of artist at that moment. He even quipped, can you imagine if Beuys or Duchamp was invited to run this workshop in the 50s, and what kind of product will come out of that? And it also made me really, vex the question, particularly when we think about politically engaged art, it doesn't get more engaged than this. And there's a remarkable coherency to the artistic language, to the historical moment it was created, and to the own experience of the artist. You really can't replicate that. So when Chen Danqing wrote about his teacher, who is a student of Maximov, he wrote, unless you've experienced it yourself, there's no way that you can fully comprehend or understand. And that is what is mesmerizing, I think, to me about singular artworks like this. This artist was severely persecuted and beaten up during the Cultural Revolution, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, for other kinds of historical subject paintings that are considered problematic. But he survived and even went on to teach and design these, representations of the proletariat that found their purpose on banknotes. So again, circulating into an even broader visual field. So again, not so interested in a very small elitist tradition of art history, but how it continuously leaks into broader consciousness and molds how we think about images, relates to them. And this is the artist in the 70s teaching steel workers basic principles of drawing. And now we're looking at his student Chen Danqing's work. These are from the sketches he did in the 70s while being in some sort of exile during the Cultural Revolution. A lot of intellectuals, young artists were sent to the countryside to be re-educated. And even here, he was thinking about certain, Soviet or even pre-Soviet models like Repin's paintings. He published a series of early sketches with annotations, and here he's painting a group of peasants, villagers playing poker. And he remarked that he was thinking about Repin's reply of the Cossacks. And this is a historical subject painting by Repin, the far taller painter, depicting an even earlier historical incident in the late 17th century, where the Cossacks, who are nomadic people from eastern Ukraine and southern Russia, present day, who actually defeated a battle with the Ottoman Empire at the time. But despite their victory, the Ottoman Empire still wanted them to submit to the Sultan. And so a group of the Cossacks gathered together to reply and basically insult the Sultan, because they lost the war but still expected the Cossacks to bend towards them. So this is a depiction of a roasting session, really. And Chen Danqing talked about how he tries really hard to think about that work and recreate that dynamic group. And I found this incredibly fascinating because there's no correlation in terms of the kind of the historical or the political context, but it's a way of telling story. It's a way of engineering a figure group, and coming from a century ago, informing how an artist sees in the present. And he also published earlier kind of almost comic books of a young Soviet boy who was reflecting on the revisionist tendencies of the Soviet Union. And I love the artist's remarks here where he talked about he loved all of his works during the Cultural Revolution. He does not believe in any of the scenes he painted. He does not believe in his subject matter, but he believed fully in the paintings he was creating, in the art that he was creating. And I think this is a condition that merits so much unpacking. And it really, I think, adds incredible depth to how we think about art that we habitually associate with propaganda or with very oversimplified messages, when we ignore the complex conditions that went into the making of the work from the artist's perspective, because sometimes, artists have to be very flexible in playing towards a certain regime, but retaining some of their own truth. So Chen Nanqing will, on a short trip in Tibet, during that time, Mao died. The Cultural Revolution ended, and a series of important high-power political leaders passed away. So he created this painting called Tear-Flooded Harvest, which is basically a group of peasants who overheard on the radio that Mao had passed away, and so they're weeping. And this is a very politically correct depiction at the time, and this is a work that actually gained him nationwide fame before he came to New York in the early 80s to continue his artistic practice. But if you read his account of this time, it was full of hysteria and trauma, and he even talked about how everyone was so tense about the obligation to cry, because yes, this is a historically significant moment, but at the same time, if you don't cry or if you don't show the correct emotion, you might face very serious consequences. So that emotional tension was also there. So you can say that this is an artist who is depicting how even ethnic minorities are mourning the loss of a great political leader. It is also a painting about the obligation, psychological obligation to express that kind of emotion in that time. And he was also thinking about another important late 19th century painter, Surikov, who is a contemporary of Ilya Repin. Actually, a lot of the Soviet painters were trained in the Surikov Art Academy. And this is a quote that I lifted from one of his travelogues when he finally went to Russia in 2011 or 2010, I think. And it's really ironic because many of these artists and many of the generations of painters trained on the Soviet pedagogy had never traveled to Russia. And so they're really operating on a unique form of knowledge transference that also shaped their psyche, that there's it's another complex emotion towards these models that one only learned through slides or transparencies. But here he's reflecting on how he, was looking at the transparencies of another historical subject painting and remembering every face vividly from it, and then applying that to his own creation. Check the time again. I can stop here or keep talking. Maybe 5 more minutes or longer. What? Please don't rush. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. So then I think it probably will wrap around at like 1 hour time exactly. So then after in the early 80s, Chen Nanqing, who is the guy furthest from us, came to New York, and here he's posing with another Chinese artist, Liu Xiaodong, with a Robert Gauber sculpture that you can see in the foreground. And he started to paint slightly different subject matter. And this is another important archive material that informed my dissertation. And again, this is an example of an artist whose art historical impulse brought together a group of artists that made me understand or became aware of a larger historical framework at work. So this is an exhibition organized by the American artist Mark Tansey in 1994. This is not a socialist realist painter at all. He's a artist who works with hyperrealism, but he uses them to essentially troll conceptualism. And you can see his works at the Met. He's currently represented by the Gagosian. This is a very easily searchable artist. But in 1994, he curated an exhibition, invited 4 diasporic Chinese artists living in New York at the time. Chen Nanqing included the artists who painted the Tibetan farmers, and various other subjects that I showed earlier. And in this very thoughtful curatorial essay, he reflected on his own temporal blinders that made him initially judge these Chinese painters as practicing a very outdated form of medium, artistic practice, but later realized that they were informed by an alternative modernist art-making trajectory that is valuable on its own right and is very poorly understood. And also given his own interest in realism and figuration, he was fascinated by them. So he curated this exhibition, and that showed these artists intersecting with even more aspects of New York art world, including this painting by Liu Xiaodong, who depicted John Ahern, a local artist, creating casts. Some of you might recognize it. And the guy who's currently being casted on is Ai Weiwei, who's recognizable by the belly. There are also photographs showing that it's actually him. I'm not fat shaming him. And you can see where this word corresponds to the catalog. And it's just such a New York moment. And this is by no means socialist realist painting, but I think that skill and that intense interest in the figure and in the human interest is fully present here. Another artist, Ni Jun, was painting more, politically charged subject matter, and this is an upside down helicopter from the Korean War that he kind of created and made up news image or even, historical painting about. Ni Jun was also an artist who was curatorially active. So he co-curated an exhibition called Mao 100 on the centennial year of Mao's birth in 1993. Mark Pansy's exhibition is in 1994. And MoMA PS1's large-scale survey of socialist realism was in 1993. And Komar Malamate, another pair of very important ex-Soviet artists who immigrated to New York, put out an open call on Art Forum about what is to be done about monumental propaganda. And in the catalog of Mao 100, Ni Jun and Vitaly Komar, who was the more sociable partner of the duo, and they talked about Mao and modernism, Warhol, and a particular kind of political and image condition that is, quite fascinating to see. And all of this that I have shared with you so far, and what I have learned over time, made me realize how art historically unprepared we are to fully account for what is happening. I know that there are focused treatises on art from the 50s and 60s and 70s, but they're usually considered not part of avant-garde or modern or contemporary art, and yet all of these are so much indebted to the Soviet modernism that China was a huge part of. And when MoMA published the primary materials, which is a series of documents where they divide by geographic locations and cultural specificity to collect primary materials translated, usually artist writings, curators who were making historically important shows, I got a full PDF text and I searched for Soviet. This is the only result that I found. And it's even in a footnote. It's not explained or interpreted anywhere in the main text. There's not anything linking that to this, long, very messy, but nonetheless crucial history. The only female painter from this Mark Tansey show, Yu Hong, who I showed earlier with that David head portrait, created something that is probably even further from any kind of socialist narrative. This is a self-portrait that is, charged with a kind of free spirit and unbothered by any kind of gaze. But when I had an interview with her, she talked about thinking about the hero trees that are in the background of a very important revolutionary ballet, The Red Detachment of Women, given her parents' involvement in stage design and the sheer popularity of this ballet, because it was a nationally sanctioned art form. And of course, this is also a Soviet import. Just like Konstantin Maximov, Soviet dance pedagogues also came to China in the 50s and instituted the entire dance discipline that included ballet, but also folk dance and dances that are reflective of various ethnic minorities that are both present in the USSR and in China. And the artist would go on to paint even more pointedly about the Red Detachment of Women. This is Yu Hong's painting from the 2010s, I think. And I was also thinking about this, not limited to just the medium of dance, but also a total art of some sort. This is a late Cultural Revolution ballet production that celebrates these two heroic youth who are Mongolian. And they protected the sheep of the commune to the extent that one of them, I think, had her leg frozen. But if you look at the still from the right, it shows you everything that I think the socialist narrative tends to encompass: the valorized, the glorified ethnic minority group, the overcoming of adversary for a greater political or collective goal, the beautiful natural landscape punctuated by power lines that speaks to industrialization, everything. And this is the part where one of them had her leg frozen because she was so dedicated to find the one lost sheep. I watched the videos and the choreography was actually remarkable, just like the Red Detachment of Women. And for anyone who had any experience with ballet and the canon of ballet, you probably understand that many of these narrative ballets, even though they require so much from the female dancers, the stories are not very feminist, to say the least. It's like saved by a prince, hurt by a prince, died for a prince. But these ballets, you have, women who are serving other purposes and with incredible choreography to match. So again, there's of course, there are a lot of problems in this form of representation, but I think we also lack a deep understanding of where they came from. And then this pivots to, I think, a very global model of looking at this, or thinking about this idea of representation of different people, people from different cultural, ethnic backgrounds being very intentionally heroicized or valorized in different kind of nation building narratives, solidarity narratives that, is not strange to us today, and expands, vast geographic locations. And if you look at Mexican muralist painting, this is also a very striking tenet in their practice. And there is a connection there too, because David Sigueros visited China with a very important exhibition of Mexican muralist paintings and print works. And he himself had seminars with artists where he critiqued the Soviet model and encouraged artists to look more into their own artistic and cultural, especially ethnic resources. And this is just part of a broader, again, international exchange that involved many socialist and post-socialist states, including East Germany, Mexico, other countries from Eastern Europe and Latin America, and of course, Soviet Union. And it got me, and many of these are, of course, related to concurrent political, decolonial, and liberation movements. And again, finding its connection to contemporary art, the contemporary one being Samuel Fossel's self-portrait as Mao from 2013. This is a Cameroon-born artist who dressed himself up as Mao, styled himself to important and highly recognizable portraits of Mao to think about China's present, current presence in Africa, which is heavily contested, but also traces back to an earlier moment of global South solidarity, but more importantly, a recognition of the image, the proliferation of Mao's image, and how that became a rather crucial both artistic and political strategy for many artists, and or beyond the artistic communities in their fight for liberation. And you can see that this traces not only back to these famous Mao posters, but even going back earlier to more standardized socialist realism representations like this one, The Morning of Our Country, that clearly celebrates Stalin. And I was at a lecture last week at EFLAX where Zhong Qi and Sergei Moses, two brilliant scholars and curators, talked about Maoism as an important and understudied aspect in global modern contemporary art. And it got me thinking also about, the sort of fascination or exoticization of Maoism from outside of China. On the left is a still from Godard's film La Chinoise from 1967, a year before the student movement. So there's an incredible Prussian quality to this film because he was looking at a group of young French leftist intellectuals, Maoists, who were probably harboring very naive ideas about revolution, but nonetheless, they were acting it out. And then a year later, that became a reality. And then on the right, another version of Samuel Fossel's self-stylization as Mao, based on actually a very important historical photograph of Mao, speaking in early 1949, where he came up with a strategy to focus on the agrarian population. And this is a plug-in for Zhong Qi's very important and hugely powerful new study, art historical study called Geometries of Afro-Asia, Art Beyond Solidarity, where she considers so many examples of historical trajectories finding their way into contemporary art making. And on the right is a picture I took from that lecture, where she showed the poster in a Black Panther member's home. And what was really remarkable was that she talked about this idea of representation that we so often associate with propaganda posters. But more importantly, there's an idea of undeniability, meaning when you have a poster that supports the struggle of African Americans, you're making that condition undeniable. This was her argument. And for that kind of poster to find itself in domestic intimate spaces that are at risk of being infiltrated by state violence is quite, is not to be taken lightly. And this is one of my last slides. Just to tie everything together a little bit, because I began with talking about art and technology, and then I went to this whole everything everywhere all at once narrative about socialist realism. But in this essay that Mark so graciously introduced, that is about to come out, titled Machine Envy, I looked at certain observations about Soviet cybernetics, and specifically this case, you can read later. I know I'm both talking and giving a lot of text to read, but basically there's this observation that the Soviet ideological language is so artificial that machines are probably better at writing them. And this is already becoming a reality now. Artists using this to create very politically charged works that are culturally specific. And people are using ChatGPT to write their application letters to join the Communist Party. So this is, incredibly fascinating to me. And to wrap up on this notion of, art for the people, one of the most satisfying aspects, I would say, was to check how visitors to the biennial are styling themselves within it and posting and taking selfies in these environments. And you can see the stamp of the social media platform and the ID number. So these are not mine, nor the professional photography from the museum. These are people who are posting about the show on social media, which is ironically called the Little Red Book, Mao's most significant, I think, ideological legacy, but this is now highly, highly late capitalist, where people share where to eat, where to see shows, what to wear, what to buy. And I just love how creative people are. It's almost like it's not like, it's basically them co-creating and co-authoring the show with me. And on the right, a lot of people post with this 1970s Toshio Matsumoto, this Japanese avant-garde video artist who combined texts from the Heart Sutra Buddhist script with images from various religious sources, but also cosmic images to just flash out at the audience. And a lot of people take pictures with these gigantic characters, attempt to shake hands with a flowery figurehead and lying on the mats, and using the reflection to still capture the relationship between Amile and Siamajani. And also many of them paid attention to the kind of prompts and quotes that I not only included in the exhibition brochure, but also I posted some of these in the exhibition space. They're not intrusive to the works, but you sometimes encounter these. And this is a line from a video work by Agnieszka Polska, a Polish artist who had a beautiful video in the show. And it's a romantic story about nationwide electricity in a post-socialist Poland called 1,000-Year Plan. So it also has a clear fictional aspect to it. This is Walid Rad's Comrade Leader, How Nice to See You, where he used these beautiful waterfalls in Lebanon that are named after foreign aides and political leaders who were interfered in the warfare, and then creating miniature forms of these political leaders that include Reagan, Thatcher, the likes, to have the waterfalls wash over them. And you can see kids like to play with the shadow and the scale of it. And then to end with maybe my favorite piece of fan art of the show that also, I think, gives you a better sense of the space. I know, it's doing my work for me. That's it. Thank you.